Hi class, in this video I am going to go over chapter 3 of the They Say, I Say textbook. Now before we get started with that, I did want to show you where you can find the readings because I've been getting a lot of questions about how do I know what I'm supposed to read for that week. So what you want to do is you want to go ahead and go to our homepage, and then you want to scroll down to the syllabus. Or if you have already downloaded the syllabus, you can just go ahead and refer to the syllabus. Remember that you can just click on syllabus and you can download it to your computer. But right now we are just previewing it on Canvas. So what you want to do is you want to go ahead and click all the way down to our schedule. So like I mentioned in my syllabus video, I divided it up into reading and due dates. So for example, right here, this is what we have to read. So if you look at this week we have to read W10 from the Little Seagull Handbook, and of course also chapter 3 from They Say, I Say. So that is what we're going to go over today. Once you've done that, checked your syllabus, you can go ahead and go to the ebook webpage. Now, you might have downloaded your ebook, so in this case you probably don't have to do this. I haven't downloaded the ebook, so I'm going to show you through the computer. So what you want to do is you want to go ahead and click on sign in. My email has already been memorized, and then I just need to type in my password. So if you have the access card, make sure that you set it up on this website. Okay, so we're going to go over chapter 3. And last time we went over chapter 2, which is the art of summarizing. But with chapter 3, it's very important, and it's actually quoting is something that we do a lot, and it is also something that you're going to be doing a lot in English 111. So it's important to make sure that you do it well. And I'm also going to go ahead and show you some resources that I have on our Canvas page that go along with this chapter. So when you're summarizing, like I mentioned in the last video, you don't want to quote. The book says that you can quote in your summary, but I would prefer if you didn't, because if you quote in the summary, it basically becomes just like one giant quote. And whether you're writing a summary or any type of essay, you don't want to quote too much. You want to make sure that the majority of it is your own words. So to avoid that, for the summary, instead of quoting, just paraphrase. And whenever you're writing an essay, you want to make sure that you quote, but you only quote when it comes to putting things that are really important or that are going to support your argument. So, for example, here the book says, quoting someone else's words gives you a tremendous amount of credibility. So essentially, that's the reason why we quote. We quote so that we can say, look, I'm not the only person saying this. Somebody else thinks that too. So therefore, this makes me more credible. So quoting definitely adds something to your paper. I'd like to think of quotes as sort of like a condiment to your paper. You know, it's like if you like to eat and you put like sauces and spices and all of those things. That's what quotes do. They spice up your paper. So the book continues to say that a lot of writers make a lot of mistakes when it comes to quoting. So according to the book, you can quote too little. And like I mentioned, yes, this happens because sometimes sometimes the essay is not as interesting because the person hasn't quoted enough, right? So sometimes when we are reading an essay, we say, okay, but do you have any facts? Do you have any evidence to support this? So in that case, the person is quoting too little because they haven't included enough evidence or examples. And then the book says at the opposite extreme are the writers who overquote. I've also read essays where people overquote, and it just becomes really overwhelming because you cannot find any original idea. Everything is a quote, and you start asking yourself, well, what is the writer actually writing? Because all of this is a quote. So you want to make sure that you avoid that. Another problem is when the writer assumes that the quotations speak for themselves. When it comes to quoting, you always have to explain the quote. You cannot leave the quote by itself. So this is what this paragraph is referring to, that you want to go ahead and always introduce a quote and then explain it. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more right now. So something else to keep in mind is that you want to make sure you only quote relevant information to your essay. So you don't want to have quotes that have nothing to do with whatever you are talking about. You want to make sure that quotes are always relevant to your argument, or that you can go ahead and build on that in relation to your argument. And like the book says, it's not always easy to find relevant quotes. That's why you have to go and look through research and through articles and things like that to find quotes that actually have something to do with what you are writing about. Next, here we have the frame every quotation. So this is what we refer to as the quotation sandwich. Now your book calls quotes that are by themselves dangling quotations or hit and run quotes. And the problem with the hit and run quotes is that you leave it up for interpretation. Like for example, if I say 85% of people text and drive, that's not telling you if I'm against or for texting and driving. So I need to introduce that quote and then I need to explain it. So if we move forward, it talks about what you should do. So like for example, right here, it is telling you that Deborah Tannen writes about academia. Well, they're telling us that she writes about academia, but they're not really telling us who she is or why she's a credible source. So that's why the book says that the student fails to introduce a quotation adequately because they do not tell us who she is or how her claims connect to what the argument is saying. So you don't want to just say, here's this person, here's the quote. You want to tie it into your essay. So over here we have some templates. Please feel free to use these templates because they really help you to introduce quotes. So one way to introduce the quote is by using a signal phrase. A signal phrase is basically a word that we use to introduce the quote. So signal phrases are also known as attributive tags, which means that you're attributing the quote to somebody. So signal phrases are things like according to X. Let's say the author is Smith. According to Smith, Smith himself writes, in her book, They Say I Say, Smith maintains that. So as you can see, you can go ahead and use these for your papers whenever you are writing them and you want to quote somebody. Smith agrees when she writes. So again, all you have to do is plug in the author's last name and then go ahead and put the quote in here. Now this is just for introducing the quote. I'm going to show you a handout that I have on Canvas. So here we are back on Canvas and we are going to go to modules and we're going to scroll down. And here I have the quoting, paraphrasing, summarizing, but I also have the APA and research tools module at the very end of the modules. And if you look here, I also have some, I have a handout about quoting and other information about incorporating sources. So if you want to go ahead and look at this one, The Art of Quoting, it basically gives you a visual of what quoting should look like. So this is taken from the chapter, but here we have a visual. So this is what we call the quotation sandwich. Like I mentioned earlier, you always want to introduce a quote, and then explain the quote. So the signal phrases are what you use to introduce the quote. And here in this handout, we've included the templates that we just saw in the textbook. So you introduce the quote by saying, according to Smith, Smith argues that, whatever. And then you go ahead and you put the quote. And then that brings us to the explaining of the quote. So when you explain the quote, that's when you tell us how the quote relates to what it is that you're saying. So basically, a quote cannot be on its own. You always have to go ahead and put the quotation sandwich. Some people also say to ICE a quote. So ICE stands for introduce, cite, and explain. So whatever you do, remember to not leave a quote by itself. because of this, we recommend that you do not begin a paragraph with a quote, and we recommend that you do not end a paragraph with a quote, because the quote needs to be explained. So this handout is based off of chapter 3. So if you want to have a handout that condenses chapter 3, definitely go ahead and make sure that you go to the modules and then click all the way down, and you can go ahead and, sorry for all those noises, I just keep getting emails and things like that. So you can go ahead and scroll down to the very last module and click on the art of quoting. And of course I have like other information on quoting, paraphrasing, and summarizing. And you know, all you have to do is click on those, but I'm actually going to go ahead and put that handout. I'm going to send an announcement with this video attached, and I'm going to put that handout attached there as well so that you can have quick access to it. Okay, so now that I showed you that handout, we're going to go back to our book. So like I mentioned, it has templates for introducing quotations, and then it also has templates for explaining quotations. And when you explain the quotation, you don't want to just go ahead and basically just say something that is very minuscule. Like, for example, the previous example I used, 85% of people text and drive. So the way I would introduce that would be by saying, according to John Smith from the El Paso Times, 85% of people text and drive. When I'm explaining it, I cannot say something like, that's a lot. That's not a good explanation, right? Here, the book tells us it's important to use language that accurately reflects the spirit of the quoted passage. So, with statistics, it's a little bit difficult because they're just numbers, so there's really no spirit to them. But you want to say something like, clearly this is a very high number, which means that either the police are not enforcing texting and driving, or people are not listening to the laws, so something else has to be done. So that's a good explanation, because I'm not just saying, oh, that's a lot of people. I'm actually saying what it means. I'm saying, if that many people are still texting and driving, then clearly something's going on, because people are either not following the law or the law is not being enforced. So that's what you want to do whenever you explain a quote. Talk about how it relates to your argument and talk about what the quote means. In this case, I could be arguing that we need tougher laws on texting and driving. So that's how that quote relates to my argument. So, moving on, here's an example. As you can see in this example, they actually tell us who she is, and then they give us the quote, and then over here, they explain it, and then they continue discussing it. So, I don't think you should discuss it in a separate paragraph. I think you can just go ahead and discuss it right after the quote. And remember, it has to be related to the quote, and it has to relate to your argument. Sometimes people say they explain the quote, but it's not really directly. Like, for example, the example I just gave you. If I write, according to El Paso Times, 85% of people text and drive, people say something like, texting and driving is a problem. But again, it's not directly explaining the 85%. I hope that makes sense. So this is a really good example. And the book also gives you another tip, which is to blend the author's words with your own. So feel free to make sure that you are using your own words whenever you explain the author's quote, right? And it says a follow-up sentence in the previous example we just saw uses enough of her language while still moving the discussion in the student's direction. So whenever you explain the quote, you want to make sure that you're using your own language so that we know this is still your argument, it's still your essay. So that brings us to a question: can you overanalyze a quotation? Yes, you can, because, like, for example, the example I gave you, 85% of people text and drive, that is just a statistic. If you were to write a whole paragraph explaining that quote, that would be too much. So I would say in general, maybe explain the quote in 2 to 4 sentences. So if the quote you have used is requiring you to explain it in 2-3 paragraphs, then yes, it's too long or you're overanalyzing it. Because a quote should not be so complicated that it's taking you 3 paragraphs or anything like that. So moving on to the final part of this chapter, the chapter says how to not introduce quotations. So basically what the chapter is saying is, although some writers do, you should not introduce quotations by saying something like Orwell asserts an idea or a quote by Shakespeare. And the reason for that is because they can be a little bit redundant, because you're saying here's a quote, but we know it's a quote because we can see it's a quote because it has quotation marks. So you don't want to basically be repetitive, nor do you want to say he once quoted, because again, he didn't just quote that once, he probably said that a bunch of times. So I would suggest that in order to not fall under this trap of how to not introduce quotations, I would say to just go back in your textbook and go ahead and look at the templates for introducing and explaining. And I think the templates are really helpful. So I hope this lecture over chapter 3 was helpful. If you have any questions, please let me know.